It is the early 1970s, Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. A city of gleaming monuments, marble facades, and power corridors where decisions shaped the world. Tourists snapped photos at the White House, senators drove home after late sessions on Capitol Hill, and the Pentagon's shadow stretched across the Potomac. But beneath that surface, something darker was stalking the streets. A single note, scrawled in a young girl's handwriting, found in the pocket of a murdered teenager. This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me, if you can. It was signed only, the Freeway Phantom. Over 2 years, young black girls disappeared from their neighborhoods, their bodies dumped on the very highways that carried lawmakers to and from their seats of power. The killer was never caught. This is the story of the Freeway Phantom. Before we begin, let me ask you, where were you in 1971? Can you picture Washington, D.C. at that moment? A city on edge, haunted by fear, while its children disappeared one by one? If you're fascinated by cold cases, unsolved mysteries, and the haunting echoes of crimes left unanswered, make sure to subscribe and join us as we dive into one of America's most chilling unsolved serial cases. The story begins on April the 25th, 1971. 12-year-old Carol Denise Spinks was just like any other child in Southeast D.C. She loved music, laughed often, and dreamed of traveling beyond her neighborhood someday. Her mother was strict, protective. She didn't want her children wandering too far. But, like most kids, Carol sometimes pushed boundaries. That Sunday, her older sister asked her to run to the nearby 7-Eleven for groceries. It was only a short walk, a few blocks, an ordinary errand on an ordinary day. But ordinary days can turn sinister in an instant. Carol left home around 7 p.m., carrying coins and a shopping list. Neighbors saw her walking back with the groceries in her hands, and then, nothing. 6 days later, her body was discovered off Interstate 295. She had been strangled. For her family, the nightmare had just begun. For the city, it was the first step into a terror that would last for years. Timeline of victims: Darlenia, Denia Johnson, age 16, on July 8, 1971. Just months after Carol's murder, 16-year-old Darlenia Johnson left home for her summer job at the Oxon Hill Recreation Center. She never arrived. For 11 agonizing days, her family searched. Flyers were posted, neighbors joined in, but hope drained with each passing day. Her body was eventually found in a wooded area near the very road where Carol had been dumped. Like Carol, she had been strangled. The pattern was beginning. Brenda Faye Crockett, age 10, July 27, 1971. Brenda Crockett, just 10 years old, ran an errand for her mother. She never returned, but Brenda's case was unlike the others. That evening, the phone rang at her home. Her younger sister answered. Brenda's voice came through the line. She said she had been abducted by a white man, that she was being driven in his car, but she was coming home soon. Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Brenda was crying. She said she was in a house and a white man was standing beside her. Then, the line went dead. Hours later, her body was discovered along U.S. Route 50. She had been strangled with a scarf. Police would later theorize that Brenda had been forced to make those phone calls under the killer's direction, an attempt to confuse investigators. The cruelty was unimaginable. By now, Washington, D.C. was terrified. 3 young black girls, all gone within months. Parents began holding their daughters closer. Children were warned not to walk alone. But the killer was just beginning. Neno Moshia, Neno. Yates, age 12, on October 1, 1971. 12-year-old Neno Yates disappeared on her way to the store. For nearly 2 months, her family lived in torment, searching, hoping, praying. On November 16th, her body was found near Pennsylvania Avenue, close to the same highways as the others. The silence was deafening. Brenda Woodard. Age 18, November 15, 1971. Brenda Woodard, 18, boarded a bus after dinner with a friend. She never arrived home. That same night, her body was discovered on the shoulder of Maryland Route 202. She had been stabbed and strangled. But this time, the killer left a message. In Brenda's coat pocket was the chilling note, the only written communication from the Freeway Phantom. The handwriting belonged to Brenda herself, allegedly forced to write under her killer's command. It taunted police, mocked women, and signed off with a challenge: "Catch me, if you can." The city was in shock. This wasn't just murder. This was theater. Diane Denise Williams, age 17. On September 5, 1972, 17-year-old Diane Williams left her boyfriend's home after dinner. She never made it home. Her body was found the next day on I-295. She had been strangled, just like the others. With Diane's death, the Phantom had claimed at least 6 known victims, all young, all black, all girls, and then he vanished. At first, the police response was frantic. Task forces were formed. The FBI was called in. But soon, cracks appeared. The case crossed multiple jurisdictions: D.C. Police, Maryland State Police, and the FBI. Coordination broke down. Evidence was mishandled. Leads were abandoned. One example: a potential witness reported seeing a man watching children near one of the abduction sites. The tip was written down, but the paper vanished from the file. Another time, clothing evidence was stored improperly, later contaminated. Dozens of suspects were considered: ex-boyfriends, local predators, even members of the Green Vega gang, a group involved in abductions and assaults. Some gang members bragged about being responsible, but their stories conflicted. Nothing held up in court. Meanwhile, the killer, or killers, stayed in the shadows. For families in Southeast D.C., fear became a daily companion. Parents stopped letting their daughters walk alone. Children were escorted to school in groups. Volunteers organized search parties. Vigils were held. Posters covered street corners. But the grief was mixed with anger. The victims were all black girls from poor neighborhoods. Many in the community felt that law enforcement didn't care with the urgency they would have shown for white children from wealthier parts of the city. In churches, mothers held up photographs of their daughters, their voices breaking as they begged for justice, and yet the city carried on. Traffic sped down the same highways where the girls' bodies had been discarded, as though nothing had happened. Decades passed. In the early 2000s, investigators reopened the files. Forensic science had advanced. DNA testing was now possible. Samples from the victims were retested, but the years had taken their toll. The evidence was degraded, some samples missing, others destroyed. Composite sketches were redrawn. Age-progressed photos of the girls, what they might look like today, were shared. The FBI offered a $150,000 reward for information. But the trail remained cold. The case remains one of America's most haunting, unsolved mysteries. Who was the Freeway Phantom? The Green Vega Gangsome investigators believe multiple gang members were responsible. They had been linked to similar assaults and several bragged about involvement. But their accounts conflicted, and evidence was circumstantial. A lone predator. Others argue the crimes bore the signature of one man. The abductions were precise. The bodies were discarded along highways in patterns suggesting control and planning. The chilling note pointed to intelligence, perhaps someone with military training. Law enforcement suspect. A darker theory whispered in the community was that the killer may have been someone within law enforcement, someone who could stop young girls without raising suspicion, who knew investigative procedures well enough to stay ahead. This was never proven, but in a city already distrustful of police, it deepened the sense of betrayal today. More than 50 years later, commuters drive the same highways, unaware they are passing the places where young lives were discarded. For the families of Carol, Darlenia, Brenda, Nano, Brenda, and Diane, The pain never ended. Birthdays passed. Empty chairs at holiday dinners. Graves that should never have been filled. Unsolved doesn't mean forgotten. But, to many, it feels like their daughters were abandoned twice. Once by the killer and again by the system meant to protect them. And so the question lingers, who was the Freeway Phantom? Was it a gang of predators? A single calculating killer? Someone with a badge? The Freeway Phantom left Washington, D.C. forever scarred, 6 young girls taken, and no answers even half a century later. But while one city mourned in silence, across the country another mystery was just beginning. In the snowy mountains of California, 5 young men vanished without a trace. And what was found raised even more questions than it answered. This is the case of the Yuba County Five. It is February 1978, Northern California. The Sierra Nevada mountains stretch cold and silent, the winter air biting against anyone who dares to wander too far. On a deserted mountain road, deep in the snow, a car is discovered, a Mercury Montego. Inside, empty candy wrappers, folded programs from a basketball game, and maps neatly stacked in the glove box, but no sign of the 5 young men who had driven it there. Weeks later, the thaw would reveal a cabin. Inside, the body of one of the men. He had survived for months, eating rations, wrapping himself in layers, yet slowly wasting away in the wilderness. The others were never seen alive again. What happened to the Yuba County Five? Why did they drive into the snow that night? And what strange series of events left 5 men dead in one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries? Before we begin, let me ask you, what would you do if you found yourself lost in the mountains, snow piling high, your car stuck on an isolated road? Would you stay put and wait for help, or venture into the freezing night, not knowing what lies ahead? If you're fascinated by true crime, cold cases, and mysteries that defy explanation, make sure to subscribe and join us as we unravel the case of the Yuba County Five, known today as America's own real-life missing boys mystery. Case setup. Who were the Yuba County Five? The Yuba County Five were not just any group of friends. They were young men with unique lives, challenges, and dreams. Gary Mathias, 25, a U.S. Army veteran who had struggled with mental illness but was stabilized on medication. He lived with his parents in Yuba City. Jack Madruga, 30, the owner of the Mercury Montego, found abandoned. A quiet man, dependable, and fiercely protective of his friends. Bill Sterling, 29, known for his kindness, often visiting patients in the hospital just to keep them company. Jackie Hewitt, 24, gentle, slow to learn, but full of warmth. He adored basketball, family, and routine. Ted Wire, 32, called the Gentle Giant, Ted was affectionate, dependable, and close with his family. All 5 were part of a day program for mentally challenged adults. They were considered high-functioning, but their families described them as vulnerable. They relied on structure and each other. Timeline: the last known night, February 24, 1978, the day of the disappearance. The 5 men piled into Madruga's Mercury Montego and drove to Chico, California. Their destination: a basketball game at California State University. The Chico State team won, and the 5 cheered loudly. They loved basketball. It was their shared passion. They were even scheduled to play their own Special Olympics game the next day. Afterward, they stopped at a local market for snacks, candy bars, sodas, and pies. Witnesses remembered them laughing, joking, full of excitement. Then, they vanished. The car. In the snow, 2 days later, a forest ranger found Madruga's Mercury Montego abandoned on a snow-covered road in the Plumas National Forest, 70 miles from Chico. The car was stuck in the snow, but not badly. It could have been pushed out by 5 grown men. The keys were gone, the doors unlocked. Inside, police found candy wrappers, programs from the basketball game, and maps folded neatly. No footprints. No sign of struggle. Just silence in the mountains. Why were they there? None of the men were outdoorsmen. They weren't hikers. They weren't campers. Their families insisted they would never willingly drive into the snow. Over the next week, helicopters scoured the mountains. Police on snowmobiles combed trails. Volunteers trekked through drifts, calling out their names. Nothing. The mountains kept their secret. The thaw. A grim discovery, June 1978. 4 months later, the snow melted. A group of motorcyclists came across a U.S. Forest Service trailer near the mountains. Inside, tragedy. The body of Ted Dwyer lay inside, stretched across a bed, wrapped in sheets. He had grown a beard, indicating he survived for as long as 13 weeks after the disappearance. Near him were empty ration cans, sea rations stored in the cabin. But here's the chilling detail. In the cabin were plenty of supplies. Food, clothes, blankets, even propane that could have provided heat. Yet none had been used. Why? Outside, the remains of Sterling and Madruga were found along the road leading to the trailer. Further up, fragments of Hewitt's bones and clothes were discovered, scattered by animals. Gary Mathias was never found. To this day, his body has never been recovered. The scene raised more questions than answers. Why didn't the men use the propane? Why didn't they eat more of the stored food? Why didn't they start a fire? Was it fear, confusion, or the influence of someone else? Investigators considered several possibilities. Disorientation. Perhaps the men, lost and panicked, simply didn't know how to survive. Mental health factor. Gary Mathias had a history of psychiatric issues. Did he lead the group astray? Outside involvement. Some speculated the men encountered someone else that night, someone who lured or forced them into the mountains. One witness claimed to have seen them at a local store with another man the night they vanished. Another said they spotted headlights near the abandoned car, but none of these leads were ever confirmed. For the families, grief mixed with frustration. Parents couldn't understand. Why would their sons, who hated the cold and were unprepared for wilderness, end up in the snowy mountains? Mothers clutched photos, demanding answers. Brothers scoured maps, retracing routes, hoping to find some clue. The case became known as the American Dyatlov Pass, echoing the mysterious deaths of hikers in Russia decades earlier. Over the years, investigators revisited the files. Forensic analysis confirmed Ted Dwyer had likely survived the longest. His feet were badly frostbitten. His body weight had dropped dramatically, yet he had access to food and fuel. Why didn't he use them? Was he too weak? Or waiting for someone who never returned? Some theorized that Gary Mathias, the only one never found, may have gone to seek help and perished elsewhere in the wilderness. Others whispered that he may have lived, vanishing into another life. Theories: accidental disorientation. The men may have simply gotten lost, panicked, and succumbed to the elements. But families insist they would never have willingly driven into the snow. Gary Mathias's influence with his history of psychiatric issues, perhaps Gary panicked or insisted on taking the mountain road. But would the others have blindly followed? Outside foul play, some locals believe the group encountered another person that night. Perhaps they were threatened, forced, or misled into the mountains. The neatness of the car, the unexplained use of supplies, and the missing body of Gary keep this theory alive. Today, more than 45 years later, the story of the Yuba County Five remains a haunting mystery. The abandoned car in the snow. The bodies found months later. The supplies left untouched. And the one man who vanished forever. Families were left with empty chairs at dinner tables, birthdays without candles, and decades of unanswered questions. What happened that night in the Sierra Nevada mountains? Were the 5 victims of their own confusion, or of something far darker? The mystery of the Yuba County Five left families shattered and investigators baffled. 5 young men lost in the mountains, their fate never fully explained. But while California struggled with its unanswered questions, the desert hundreds of miles away in New Mexico was preparing to reveal a far darker secret. A secret buried beneath the sand, where the remains of 11 women would be uncovered. The work of the killer now known as the West Mesa Bone Collector. The desert of New Mexico is vast and unforgiving. Stretching endlessly under the blazing sun, it swallows secrets whole. But in 2009, a construction worker's dog made a discovery that would shock the nation. Bones. Human bones. At first, one set, then another, and another. By the time investigators finished, 11 women had been unearthed from a patch of desert west of Albuquerque, all buried in shallow graves, all gone for years without anyone knowing where they had vanished. The killer was never caught. The desert still keeps its secrets. This is the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector. Before we begin, let me ask you, what does it mean for 11 women to vanish, one after another, from a single city, and for years no one to connect the dots? If you're fascinated by cold cases, unsolved serial murders, and the haunting stories left in the shadows, make sure to subscribe and join us as we dive into one of the most chilling cases of the 21st century. In the early 2000s, Albuquerque was a city in transition. Known for its desert beauty, Route 66 nostalgia, and sprawling neighborhoods, it also carried shadows of poverty, crime, and drug epidemics. Along East Central Avenue, the city's main strip, sex work and drug activity were common. For women caught in that cycle, life was precarious. Between 2003 and 2005, women began vanishing from Albuquerque. At first, the disappearances seemed isolated, tragic but not unusual for lives lived on society's margins. But in reality, someone was hunting. The 11 women whose remains were eventually discovered shared commonalities. Many were in their 20s and 30s, mothers, daughters, sisters. Several struggled with addiction. Most were involved in sex work. Their names should never be forgotten. Michelle Valdez, 22, Jamie Barella, 15, Veronica Romero, 27, Victoria Chavez, 26, Evelyn Salazar, 27, Virginia Cloven, 23, Julie Nieto, 24, Monica Candelaria, 22, Cinnamon Elks, 32, Selenia Edwards, 15, the only out-of-state victim, a runaway from Oklahoma. One unborn child. Michelle Valdez was 4 months pregnant when she disappeared. These were not just names and headlines, they were lives stolen. Timeline: The Vanishings 2003-2005. Women from Albuquerque begin disappearing. Family members file reports, but many cases receive little attention. Police often assumed the women had run away or drifted into new towns. Loved ones insisted these women may have struggled, but they didn't just vanish. By 2006, at least 18 women were missing in the Albuquerque area. Their cases were unconnected on paper, but the truth was far darker. The discovery. February 2009. It was a cold February day in 2009. A woman walking her dog near a newly developing subdivision on Albuquerque's West Mesa noticed her pet digging at something. Bones. Human bones. Police arrived, thinking it might be a single grave. Instead, it was a mass burial site. Over the next months, detectives uncovered the remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child buried in shallow graves across the desert floor. Albuquerque was in shock. This was not random. This was methodical. Someone had been using the desert as a dumping ground for years. The West Mesa site became one of the largest crime scenes in American history. Thousands of bones were carefully unearthed. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify victims, but the questions loomed. Who had buried them here? How had no one noticed for so long? Detectives began piecing together the victims' last known movements. Most were last seen between 2003 and 2005. All had ties to sex work. Several knew each other. The working theory: a serial killer, possibly someone posing as a client, was targeting vulnerable women, killing them, and disposing of their bodies in the desert. The investigation faced immense obstacles. Evidence. Years in the desert had destroyed DNA, fingerprints, and trace evidence. Witnesses. Many potential witnesses were involved in street life, distrustful of police, fearful of retaliation. Time gap. By the time the graves were found, the killer could have moved, died, or even been jailed for another crime. Despite hundreds of leads, no one was ever charged. For Albuquerque, the discovery was a wound that cut deep. Families of the missing gathered for vigils at the site. They demanded justice, but also recognition. Many felt their daughters' disappearances were ignored for years because of their lifestyles. Local media dubbed the unknown killer the West Mesa Bone Collector. The name stuck, adding an eerie mythos to the case, but for families, it was no myth. It was real grief. Mothers kept the victims' photos taped to walls. Children grew up without mothers. Suspects and theories. Lorenzo Montoya, local man who lived near the West Mesa area. He had a history of violence against women, arrests for solicitation, and ties to sex work. In 2006, he was killed after strangling a woman during a sex encounter. Her boyfriend shot him in defense. Many believe Montoya could have been the killer, active until his death, but no evidence directly linked him to the graves. Multiple offenders, some investigators suggest the burials may not have been the work of a single killer. Albuquerque's sex trade was dangerous, and different predators may have used the same dumping ground. 3. Human trafficking. Ties. Albuquerque lies along major highways connected to trafficking routes. Some believe the women may have been victims of organized crime or trafficking networks, their bodies disposed of in the desert. Unidentified serial killer. Others believe the bone collector is still alive, never caught, possibly even moved on to other hunting grounds. Cold case status. The FBI and Albuquerque police have kept the case open. Billboards have gone up with the victims' faces. Rewards were offered, but over a decade later, no arrests have been made. Every few years, tips trickle in, but so far, none have solved the riddle. The West Mesa desert is quiet now. Construction has covered parts of the burial ground. Families visit memorials, laying flowers where bones once lay. But the silence of the desert hides the echoes of screams that were never heard, questions never answered. 11 women and 1 unborn child, buried like secrets in shallow sand. Who killed them? Why? The desert isn't talking, and neither is the bone collector. What do you think? Was the West Mesa Bone Collector one man, or multiple killers hiding? In the same shadows? Could this case still be solved, or will the desert hold its secrets forever? Share your theories in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because some voices, even silenced, must never be forgotten.